Well, I want to start today with something of a confession. I know it's not Lent anymore, but here we go anyway. I have a tendency to get kind of annoyed by those people that just like to hear themselves talk. And I recognize the irony of saying this because what I'm about to do is talk at you for an extended time, but maybe you can imagine some of these people in your own life, right? So this can be the person that always turns the conversation back to them. You tell them, oh man, I'm so sorry, I'm late. I got a flat tire on the way here, but I'm here now. And it turns into, well, one time 10 years ago, I got a flat tire, and let me tell you. And you're like, dude, let's just get on with it. Or it might be, and this might be a special thing in the world of higher education, I'm not sure, but the people that seem to make everything this large, weighty, philosophical discussion. Oh, I see that your dress is blue and white. Now, do you know the history and the philosophy that undergirds the particular color combination of blue and white? And you're thinking, okay, come on, let's go on. So I don't know who that person is. I won't ask you to name any names. And if you're struggling to think of anybody, perhaps that's the Spirit telling you it might be you. I'll let you pray about that. But all this is to say, throughout the book of Acts, we find an awful lot of people talking. In the first part of Acts, frequently Peter is making some speech about something or another. By the time we get to later in Acts, then Paul comes on the scene and Paul starts talking all the time. And as much as I love Jesus, there are times that I'm like, Peter and Paul, could you just shut up for 5 seconds? We get it. And so I think that is why I so like the story that we heard read from Acts today. Now, I don't know if you noticed this, but there's actually very little in the way of talking that goes on. In fact, there are only 2 lines of dialogue in the whole thing. One from the messengers who send for Peter and have this stunning line of dialogue. Are you ready? Please come to us without delay. Ooh, wow. They really brought out the big guns for that one. And then one more line, Tabitha, get up. That is all that we've got for talking. And yet what I would like to suggest is in this story of Tabitha's resurrection, we have the gospel proclaimed with more power than in any of the speeches that we find throughout the rest of the book of Acts. So what I'm going to be arguing is that the gospel is getting preached, but not through words. So let's find out how this happens. Well, we begin in verse 36 by hearing something about Tabitha. We're told that she's a disciple. And now this is especially interesting because the particular word that the text uses here is not the normal disciple word. See, the normal disciple word, here's your Greek lesson for the day, is the word mathetes. And we're going to practice Greek together so you can say that you learned something. So after me, we're going to say mathetes. Mathetes. Look at y'all speaking Greek like pros. I am so proud. Does my heart good. Well, that is not the word that we actually get here in Acts. Instead, we get a feminine form of the word. Mathetes, you knew this because you're all Greek scholars, I know, is actually a masculine form. It's grammatically masculine. But the term used for Tabitha is mathetria. This is a feminine form. This is a way of saying that Tabitha is this special kind of disciple who is a female disciple. And it's the only time in the whole New Testament that this word is ever used, and it's applied to Tabitha. So she has no lines. I'm not sure if you've noticed this. Tabitha has 0 speaking parts throughout this entire thing. The only thing she does is die and get resurrected again. But we're told that she's a disciple. And what else are we told? We are also told that she was devoted to good works and acts of charity. Good works and acts of charity. We're going to find out in a minute about what those particular good works and charity acts were. But that is all that we know about her. And then the story goes from here. Tabitha dies. And so this is when the messengers are sent to Peter to bring him in. And this is where we get their one line of dialogue. Please come to us without delay. Thank you, messengers. Couldn't have done it without you in the story. You really moved that along for us. And Peter goes. And I find this interesting as well. this is where I would have expected a little bit more speech, because if I am Peter, if I am sitting in his shoes, I have a lot of questions. Where are we going? How long does it take to get there? How much should I pack? Am I going to be there a long time? Who am I going to find when I get there? What should I do when I get there? What should I wear? What should I not wear? How many pairs of shoes do I need? Lots and lots of questions that I would have that Peter apparently doesn't ask. He simply gets up and he goes. Now, what does he find when he gets there? He finds some people mourning. And who is it that is mourning? Well, the text tells us in verse 39, it's a group of widows. A group of widows is mourning Tabitha. And I'm left wondering, why is it these widows? Where is her family? Is she herself a widow? Is that why we hear nothing of husbands? Is she childless? Is that why we hear nothing of children? What about her parents, brothers, sisters? We hear nothing of Tabitha's family. Instead, it is these widows who have gathered to mourn her. And what this suggests to me is that Tabitha has built a life of good works and charity precisely to this group that is most marginalized by their society, by widows. Widows who are often socially powerless, who often are on the very edges of economic desperation because they might not have a means of providing for themselves. It is these widows who are mourning Tabitha. And more than that, the text goes on to tell us that the widows are gathered there, they are weeping, and they are showing tunics and other clothing that Tabitha had made. They're showing the works of Tabitha's hands. They're showing the things, not that she said, but that she did, the ways that she prepared for them. And what I think that these widows are doing is practicing resurrection. See, Tabitha at this point is still dead. There's no sign that she is going to be brought back to life. And yet the widows, as they show the tunics, as they show the clothing that she made, they are speaking that which is dead into the life that continues after her. And I think we know this. I would suspect that we've had this experience as well. As I was reading the text, I was reminded of a loss that I had just this past year. One of my friends in December passed away unexpectedly. She was relatively young, in her early 50s, perfect health, no sign that this was coming. And there were a number of us that were really close to her and that were unable to go to her memorial. She was in Florida, we were in California and New Jersey and Ohio and Michigan, and yet we felt this loss. We felt a way in which we couldn't process this loss. And so all of us gathered together one afternoon on a Zoom call, and we remembered her. We talked about Fiona. We talked about the ways that she would run with her dog every single morning, and we were in awe that she could run, 6, 7, 8 miles every single day. We talked about the ways that she, as a college professor, had poured life into her students and was loved by her students. We even talked about the one sweater that she always wore because she was from Florida and we would meet in winter, and so she only had the one sweater and she would always wear it. And she was still dead by the time we were done. But we had talked her into life in our memories. We had practiced a resurrection of the life that she had given to us while she was here. And I think that's what these widows are doing. Before Peter even gets on the scene, these widows are already practicing resurrection. They are looking at that which is dead, and they are saying there was life here, and that life continues in this clothing that she made, in the things that she did for us. Tabitha's life continues even after it's over. And so for me, in some ways, this is almost the height of the story. I could almost stop here without getting to Peter on the scene and say, look, we've had resurrection, we've practiced resurrection and telling the story of the life of Tabitha and showing what she's done for us. But the story does go on. We do actually get Tabitha resurrected, right? So Peter comes on the scene. He puts the mourners outside, says to her, Tabitha, get up. And in fact, she does. And what is also notable to me is who sees this. So after Peter has performed this resurrection, he recognizes, like, hey, people are going to notice that Tabitha's not dead anymore. We should probably, introduce them to this so they're not totally freaked out. And so it says that he shows the saints. And who else? The widows. The widows who had been already practicing resurrection are among the first witnesses of her actual resurrection. And to me, this is even more mind-boggling given the setting in the first century. So, brief history lesson. You've learned your Greek for today. Do you remember the word? Yo, come on. There's going to be a quiz. I'm really worried about you. Mathetes was your disciple word. There you go. Okay, but in any case, history lesson. So within the first century world, there are certain people who are seen as viable witnesses. And we're getting this from the first century historian Flavius Josephus. He tells all this long history about the Jewish people. And in one of his long writings, he says, okay, every now and then you're called upon to give some kind of testimony. We might think of courts where witnesses give testimony. And so Josephus says, well, there are certain kinds of things that should happen when receiving testimony. Number one, you want to make sure that you have the proper number of witnesses. So if you only have one person saying something, that's not really all that great. Ideally, you want at least 3 people who can kind of provide evidence. If you don't have 3, maybe 2, okay. But the first thing is you want a proper number of witnesses. And we have that in this text. We have the saints, we have the widows. Okay, so we have at least 2 groups of witnesses there. But then Josephus goes on to say, okay, there are certain kinds of witnesses that are good witnesses. And so for Josephus, the best witness is a free man. So Josephus says you don't want somebody who is enslaved. He has some issues with kind of the testimony of slaves. We could get into that another day, but he says you don't want somebody who's enslaved. He also says you don't want women. Why? Because, let me quote, because this is just, it is just. Josephus says this, you don't want female witnesses, and I quote, on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. The levity and boldness of their sex. We're apparently just far too flighty, but also far too sassy that you just can't trust us. Okay, so Josephus says you shouldn't take the testimony from women. And who, in fact, are widows, if not a bunch of women, right? We have this story of witnesses of Tabitha's resurrection who are women. Those who are deemed by their society as inherently unreliable. But does that stop the message of resurrection? Does that stop the gospel from getting out? No. No, the text tells us this became known throughout Joppa. And what happened? The text goes on to say, many believed in the Lord. These women, these widows who had benefited from the good work that Tabitha had done for them, they are preaching resurrection. They are preaching the good news, and they are being believed. And I think this is all the more fascinating as we look at the story of Tabitha's life in connection with the image of God that we get in the Old Testament. God is described in many ways throughout the Old Testament, but I want to look at one particular description that we find in Deuteronomy 10 and hold that alongside of the description of God that we heard read this morning from Psalm 23. Let's start with Deuteronomy 10. In Deuteronomy 10, we get this description of God's character, what it is that God does. And the text here says this, Deuteronomy 10:17. The Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe. And listen to this part. Who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the stranger, providing them with food and clothing. Did you catch that? What is it that God does? Well, he executes justice. Who does he do it for? He does it for widows. How does he do it? He provides clothing. What did Tabitha do? She devoted herself to charity and good works. Who did she do it for? Widows. How did she do it? She provided them with clothing. And then let's look at the description of God in Psalm 23. We heard this read earlier. Notice the way that God takes care of God's people. The Lord is my shepherd. I don't have any needs. He makes me lie down in green pastures, leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. God as one who restores souls, who restores life, who brings the dead Tabitha back to life, as the widows around her have already been practicing resurrection. And so what I think we find when we look at this image of God that emerges from the Old Testament is the image of a God who's doing the very things that Tabitha and the group of widows around her have been doing. They have not perhaps been like the Peters and the Pauls who've gone around and just talked everybody's ear off. They have been the ones that have been quietly providing the clothing, doing the good deeds, doing the charity, and they are the ones who allow the gospel to be proclaimed throughout all of Joppa. And this gives me hope for our task today. It may not be that many of us are going to give long, windy speeches, but there are ways that all of us can engage in the same kind of acts of justice that Tabitha and the widows engaged in. We too can engage in ways of caring for our community. We can give to gift cards for our families at Head Start. We can hang signs on our church fence proclaiming that we think Black lives do matter in our communities. We can stand with our students when they are facing discrimination, and in our ways of enacting justice, we too can practice resurrection. And so I pray the story of Tabitha, the story of the widows around her, would be an inspiration to all of us. May we go and do likewise. Amen.